What am I working with? Dan, you have to take a finger.
I feel for you all.
If you can do that, you'll only lose by 20.
It's incredibly boring.
How is that boring?
Carry on.
Shut up, you. If anybody mentions Taylor Swift, it's a straight red card and a 2-pod ban.
We got everything right last week. Yeah, cruised it last week.
Pretty sure I only got one wrong.
Professional, one wrong.
Unbelievable.
I tell you what, it's Harry. Press the button.
Yes, hello, welcome along to Utter Punts. This is episode 3, which is actually the 4th episode that we've done this season, but the first episode that we did was episode 0, which makes sense to me, probably doesn't make sense to anybody else, and it's because of the format and the fact that we weren't. It doesn't matter. Look, let's just get on with having a chat about the NFL, shall we? First up, let's introduce you to the crew that we've got with us today. Dave Keane, the Brummie Viking, is with us, and whisper it, but he might actually be cheerful.
I can't recall a time I'm not cheerful, as far as I'm concerned. I'm the soul of gentility, grace and good humour. But yeah, all of my sports teams are winning, which it actually makes it to my face now.
Yeah, I mean, who'd have thought it? The Vikings playing good football and Birmingham City beating teams. Turns out, cheers Dave, right up. Also in Birmingham, but not with his uncle, is little Ollie Keane. Hello mate, how are you?
I'm also doing great because my teams are also winning.
Weird that it's the same teams as your uncle, which might explain why the pair of you are grinning like Cheshire Cats. Literally nothing more to say on the subject. Helping us out this week from Good Teams Win, Great Teams Cover is Paul Redman. And look, Paul's in because Jim's not available and Dan's not available, and he's the first one on the substitutes list. So we gave him a call and he's stepped in at late notice, and it's absolutely brilliant to have you with us, Paul. Have you had a good weekend, mate?
Yeah, cheers for having us on. Thanks very much, Liam. It's next man up mentality. Get the next man in to help out. Cracking weekend, a bit of a mixed bag for my sports teams, but United got a good win at the weekend, and the Dallas Cowboys sadly didn't. But you can't have it all. Dave and Ollie can, but I can't.
It won't last long for them too, let me tell you. It's just a matter of time until the wheels come off somewhere, whether it's the Vikings or the Blues is yet to be seen. And look, as a fellow Manchester United fan, we are also very well aware that it's just a matter of time until the wheels come off somewhere along the line. They're already flown off my clown car in terms of the New York Giants, so the less said about the Giants, the better, despite a slightly improved performance against the Commanders this week. Right, who's starting? Dave, do you want to go first? Because we're into week 2 of the season, and it's the time where everybody starts in American sports turning to the stats to try and back up arguments, and well, you've already got beef with it, mate.
Yeah. So for statistics, there's analytics, and then there's just data. And what's important when you're trying to infer some analytics is to understand the fact that you need to have a reasonable sample size, so enough data to be able to make a reasonable judgment on an outcome or form an opinion. Understanding the context of where the stats come from is also important. So good example of this was last week when Dan, bless you, we do miss you, mate. He popped what he thought was a brilliant stat in, and as a man who's a business analyst who works in analytics, I looked at it and was like, it's not a stat, mate, it's just data observation, it's different. And the reason it's different is because within that particular message, there were such feats as the 49ers were the first team to have a 5th round or later running back run for a certain number of yards, have a 5th round or later quarterback throw for a certain number of yards. And then one of the lines was, and have a wide receiver who goes for 59 yards. And it's like, so why 59 yards? Is that some kind of landmark? Well, no, it's not. So whoever came up with the stat just went, I can make this fit by choosing 59. And for me, it's like, right, okay, so it's an observation, it's not a problem, but it's not really something which impresses me at all, because you're just sticking an arbitrary line in and go, right, that's a threshold that's been passed. And
100% I'm with you. I'm just going to read you the stat in full, so everybody. So just for absolute clarity and making sure that the data that we are providing is clear and accurate, Dave. 49ers on Monday night said down first team in the Super Bowl era to have a quarterback throw for 200 plus yards, a running back rush for over 125 yards, a receiver over 59 yards, and an interception. But the key here was all by different players drafted 200 or later or undrafted. So the point that he was trying to make was good recruitment from the 49ers to find these players that weren't necessarily high up the draft order. However, the stat has, it's been wrestled somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, which is fine. Like it's all good. I mean, like if that stat had been at 50 yards, you can almost say, well, that is a waypoint, right? 50-yard reception game. That seems fair. But the fact that it was set at 59 suggests that another team had done all of that, and just had only had a 58-yard receiver instead. So, or potentially, but that's not the point. It's not just Dan. I'm having a pop at here. It's more the concept of sample size, and we've only had, for example, a 17-game season since 2021. So. For me, records which are actually prorated across games are a more meaningful stat than the overall totals at end of seasons. Because now, if for example, Justin Jefferson goes for 2,000 receiving yards, but he does it in an extra game, that's not as impressive as when, for example, Megatron did it for the Lions in 16 games, right? So it's just important to keep an eye on where stats are coming from, who's producing the stats, and then what can potentially impact the accuracy of those stats. Which brings me on to the next thing, PFF. Right?
Oh, okay. Just hold that thought on PFF. We'll come back to it in a second, but let's just talk to the lads about statistics. So the other argument about the specific stat that we were talking about there that Dan provided, Paul, is that is it that somebody's gone 59 yards is the bar to make that stat work, or is it just that the player in question had 59 yards when the stat was created? And the follow-up question to that is this where American sports probably have it slightly wrong? We base everything on the eye test, really, don't we, in UK sports, and that works for us. The Americans absolutely love numbers when it comes to their sport, don't they?
Yeah, I think in that case it feels like it was just kind of shoehorned in to make it work, and I think we're seeing this across not only obviously American sports we're seeing, but we're seeing it across other sports in the UK as well now. It's infiltrated our football as well. These stats, expected goals is a great example of that.
Down with XG. Down with XG.
But yeah, I think it's just to fit that, and it's just a way to try and get points across to back them up without actually any of the real work behind it. But yeah, certainly for me, I do love a good stat, but I'm definitely the eye test is what needs to pass for me.
I just like a stat to have the context understood. That's all. Ollie, your thought on these made-up stats that I always come up with when we're watching Sunday games? But at least I do it with a grin on my face and tell you I've made them up.
Well, I've got a real stat for you.
The
San Francisco 49ers have not beaten the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota since 1992, and we are now 8-0 against them. And furthermore, Brock Purdy is 14-0 versus NFC teams, except the Minnesota Vikings, who he is 0-2 against. That's a real stat.
Okay, so that's a stat, but think about the sample size, right? Again, you've got this situation where Brock Purdy's played the Vikings twice. So what can we actually use that stat to maybe have a suggestion of? Is there a greater element behind that stat? Now, when he played the Vikings and lost to them, it's last year and it's this year, right? So, is there a greater element which falls behind that stat? And I happen to know that there is. Because Brian Flores was the Vikings DC for both those games. And not only that, have a look at Brock Purdy's record and the San Francisco 49ers record in particular, because I don't think this is relevant, I don't think Purdy was there. But have a look at Shanahan's offense generally against a Brian Flores defense. And it goes back a while. It's interesting. So it's horses for courses, right? The Shanahan offense is very, like...
I know what that's about as well. Well, because what Carl Shanahan's great at is reading patterns of play. That is what he's meant to be an expert in. With Brian Flores' defense, there's no particular pattern to follow. It's more organised chaos, which is why Shanahan really struggles with that, because that's not what he's used to. Whereas with the other teams, you'll eventually find a pattern of blitzing. You'll find a pattern within the coverages when they drop back. But with Flores, there is no pattern. Brock Purdy even said that after the game.
So now what you have is a hypothesis, but it is not a proven thing. Now you would need to assess whether or not future evidence stacks that up. And that's my point. You can't make a conclusion early, even whether it is that background context.
So there's a great journalist in the UK, and he's a good pal of mine. His name is Carl Anker, and Carl works for The Athletic, and he's big into his stats. But his big thing at the moment is context. He wants game state. He wants you to know that some of those stats are skewed because of the state of play of the game at that particular time. The example of this, and sorry to go back to soccer here, was Manchester United against Liverpool. United lost that game 3-0. They were absolutely dreadful for large parts of it, and they'll hold their hands up and admit that. But once Liverpool had taken their foot off the gas in the second half, Manchester United created 3 or 4 chances that could have been, good opportunities to score a goal. But the situation, the context of the game at that point was that Liverpool were 3-0 up and had taken the foot off the gas. So is that chance as high a quality as a chance that's created with both teams going toe to toe? And that's kind of where we're going at with this conversation.
Yes.
Go on.
And it's like this was one of the things that I remember used to frustrate Dave a lot, obviously, because I'm going to mention his name, Kirk Cousins. Not the man himself, obviously, we all know that annoys him, but garbage time in the NFL, which is a real thing, where you're just scoring points when you know you can't win anyway. And a lot of the stats that were made up for him, he's having a great... So the year before Kevin O'Connell came in, Kirk was statistically a better quarterback, but we lost more games because most of his completions, most of his passing touchdowns happened after we'd pretty much already lost the game and didn't have any time to get back in.
Paul, are we in a situation where, as UK fans of the NFL, we just have to apply a little bit of common sense to this? We have to apply a little bit of our British sort of, let's see how we think it looks rather than what the stats are necessarily saying.
Yeah, I think you're right. A bit of common sense for sure, because these stats are just kind of pumped out a lot, and I think those game situations are key, and that can kind of help determine kind of some, whether it's useful data or useful stats that actually have some meaning, or they kind of create stats just to fit a bit of a narrative. So, and I think as a whole, UK sports fans in general are pretty good at that. It's kind of seeing something for what it is. Ultimately, if it doesn't pass the eye test, it's not going to fly, is it? So, I think as a fan base, the UK guys are pretty good at that.
Here at Utter Punts, we love watching the NFL with friends, and in our opinion, there's no better place to grab a bite to eat and watch the NFL than Bierkeller in Manchester. Whether you're grabbing a bratwurst or smashing through some wings, there's loads of HD screens and a superb choice of drinks behind the bar too. Most importantly for us though, the people are brilliant, like-minded NFL fans who want to enjoy the game and have a laugh. It's definitely one of the best venues to watch your favourite team in. Before we move on to PFF, because I know Dave wants to talk about this and the change of it, just while we're talking about stats, I thought I'd just show you this, which is...
Is it a stat?
It is a stat. It's from a company called StatMuse, and it is combined passer rating for quarterbacks from the opening 2 games of the 2024 season, right? So you can see Bryce Young at the top there, who... This is a big news story in the NFL. Will be benched for next week's game. That's kind of what everybody's thinking. And the reason for it, a lot of people will tell you, is that passer rating up the top there. The fact that he just has not managed to get going so far this season. I think what I would say is the company that he's in that list should tell you something. And also, we're going to come back to this context thing, Dave, where you've got to look at the team that Bryce Young is in before you can make a judgment on whether it's his fault that they're where they are.
Okay, so the passer rating there is for these 2 games combined. I think there's a QBR, which is a different stat by a different website, where he's on 9.6 combined out of a possible 100 over 2 games, right? So in terms of analytics generally, in focusing in on that 2-game sample, Bryce Young has apparently performed very, very badly. But the additional context for him is his entire rookie season as well. So he had 17 games where he basically couldn't get away from anything that he needed to get away from, realistically. He was constantly being hunted. He's not a big guy. Now, I've been on record in the past of saying when Bryce Young was coming out of college, his big thing that he was very, very good at was anticipation on timing routes across the middle. I didn't think he was going to get 9.1. What a nice one there. I didn't think he was going to get the time to wait for those routes to develop. But the biggest issue that I had with him, and this is very much an analytics argument, when you're looking to defend against a quarterback, it's much harder if that quarterback can threaten the entire field. You've got a solid run game, you've got an O-line which will protect him, right? And that's the context thing with him. He doesn't have an O-line. But he can also only throw the ball 40 yards. That's the furthest he can throw in American football, which is his own statement when he was asked that at his combine interviews. That means that a defence can sit there on him and he really can't do anything, because if you only have to defend within 40 yards of a line of scrimmage, you're going to get choked, and that's what's been happening. But he has been benched now, Liam, it's official. So the head coach, Dave Canales, after the game initially, he said that no, Bryce Young will still be our quarterback. Within 2 days, he changed his mind and has announced that Timothy Dalton was he the former James Bond? Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. Timothy Dalton's making a comeback, right? And Andy Dalton will be taking over for the Panthers. And he said it's because he reviewed the film. So he went back over everything, and within the circumstances, the context of the game, Dave Canales, who previously has worked with Baker Mayfield on his rehabilitation, who's the other QB he helped as well. He was massively helpful with another QB. His name's escaping me at the moment. But basically, he developed a reputation as being a bit of a quarterback whisperer. He's been brought in. After 2 games, he's decided that Bryce Young can't run his offense. And so Bryce Young is gone.
It's mental. Here's a stat for you, and this one genuinely is a stat before anybody gets on me. It makes Bryce Young the first quarterback in the modern draft era, so post-1967, to be selected number 1 overall and to be benched for non-injury reasons.
Oh, the other quarterback is Geno Smith that Canales developed.
Thanks, Ollie.
He was the quarterback coach at the Seattle Seahawks.
Yeah, bang on.
Who wants to have a little pop at this while we're talking about Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers? Paul, what's your take on the whole situation? Ollie, we'll come to you next.
Yeah, I feel a bit sorry for Bryce. To be honest, I think he was put in a very difficult situation. A team that's very talent deficient, primarily because of what they have to give up to go get that pick, and you look at what's around him from a skill position perspective. There's a very an aging, still performing Adam Thielen, and that's kind of about it. There's sort of no real run game to speak of. Very, very easy to defend against the Carolina Panthers. So I think it might be a decision to take him out of the line of fire, keeping on putting him there week in, week out. It's not helping him. It's not helping him get any better. So maybe sort of taking him out. Dave Canales mentioned done some great work with Geno, some great work with Baker Mayfield. Might have the opportunity to work with him kind of behind the scenes, not in the full view of the NFL world, and maybe there is something salvageable there in Bryce Young, but they're going to need to get him some help, offensive line and skill position. Otherwise, Bryce Young's not going to have a chance, and I think he'll be out of the NFL rather quickly. But there's a lot of work to do there for the Panthers. Andy Dalton might get you a few wins. Still can't imagine they'll get enough wins to be outside of a top 5 pick. So it's what they do with that come 2025, and that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, this offensive line thing, I understand. Obviously, you need protection, but the Panthers have invested heavily into that this off-season, and it's got worse. Also, Joe Burrow didn't have an offensive line. He was a high draft pick quarterback, and he got to the Super Bowl and should have won that Super Bowl. Was very close against the Los Angeles Rams. If you're an extraordinary talent at quarterback, which if you're the number 1 pick you should be, Caleb, then then you wouldn't. The offensive line doesn't matter as much. Of course, it's important, but if you've got that extra bit of skill, that extra it about you, then you don't really need it. I mean, there's levels to the game. Okay, there's getting to the Super Bowl, and then there's finishing 0-17, and somewhere, if he could finish somewhere decent, if just outside the playoffs, 9 wins, 8 wins, you go, okay, maybe the Panthers need to improve their offensive line. They need to improve their receiving weapons because Adam Thielen's their best wide receiver. They've drafted Xavier Legette, but he hasn't even had the ball, really, because Bryce Young can't make a completion past 5 yards. There is an element of I feel sorry for him, but at the same time, I think in the NFL, in the modern day, if you're below 6 foot, you have to be an extraordinary talent with an extraordinary setup and head coach, i.e. Russell Wilson back in the day with Pete Carroll and the Seahawks. Now, Russ wasn't the amazing quarterback that everyone said he was. He was great in the system. Say what people say about Brock Purdy, right? Pete Carroll knew how to use him. You had the Legion of Boom. You had Richard Sherman. You had Marshawn Lynch. You had an amazing team around him. The other one that comes to mind is Kyler Murray, who I think is, when he can be asked, an extraordinary talent. As we saw against the Los Angeles Rams this weekend, the Cardinals beating them 41-10. But other than that, how many quarterbacks below 6 foot do you really see succeed in the NFL? And not only that, he hasn't even got the muscle on with him. At least Russ and Kyler put on a bit of pounds. He's a skinny guy who's 5'10", with a crap offensive line. It was only going to end one way, and it's David Tepper's fault that it's ended that way for the Panthers. They should have drafted CJ Stroud.
Well, the then coach wanted to, didn't he? It's famously
Frank Reich wanted to draft CJ Stroud, but David Tepper intervened, and it's just really a shame. I mean, he is the worst quarterback in that draft, and he's the number 1.
Crazy, absolutely crazy. I flashed up that graphic because, Ollie, for those that couldn't see it, so if you're listening on Spotify, you'll be able to look at it over on YouTube. If you head over there, hit subscribe, hit the bell for notifications so you know when we drop a video. What was really interesting was that 3 of the quarterbacks that Ollie just mentioned there are actually in the top 10 in terms of ESPN's QBR rating this season. In Kyler Murray, Geno Smith, Brock Purdy, they're all sort of hiding in there, and I think it's a very valid point. Look, before we move away from stats, there is one last hurdle to cross, and that is PFF. Dave, you're going to have to explain what PFF is to people that don't necessarily know, and then you're going to have to explain what your beef is.
Okay, so PFF are a sports analytic company specifically to do with the NFL, who are based out of Cincinnati, funnily enough, and they started looking at every play of every game and having somebody grade that play for every player with a mark out of 100. Right? So basically you were going to get a composite grade based on certain rules that they implement to establish how well a player was performing. And when they first came out, I think they really came to prevalence around 2015, 2016 was when they started getting off the ground. By 2017, I think all but 3 NFL teams had deals with PFF. And indeed, by 2020, there was talk of players using PFF grades as negotiating tools within contract negotiations. So I scored a 91.6. Oh yeah, but you didn't get any sacks. So there's my composite grade. The reason we were successful was because of me. And we were literally getting arguments back from football agents because of PFF grades. That's how highly respected it started to become. Now, there were teething problems. Players for a long time had been arguing that the people who were in PFF weren't former players. Therefore, they didn't know what was meant to happen on a play, so how could they effectively grade people? But the people at PFF worked long and hard to basically take opinion out of things. So Dr. Eric Eager, he was the deputy head of analytics there. He's very much a mathematician, a professor of mathematics, I believe. And he basically started underpinning the concept of people judging with structure, right? And then they had meetings to aggregate grades, that kind of thing. And over time, they started to get much better at grading players. And the reason why people felt they were getting better at grading players is because there became to be a correlation between PFF grade and how effective people were on the field, right? So it started to pass the eye test. Yeah, so people were looking at a game, they were seeing what was happening in the game, and the PFF grades were starting to show the hidden little gems in there, the people who did the things that made it possible for someone to go and get sacks, that kind of thing. So it became really quite popular. But the issue is, an organisation is only ever as good as the people who are in it, and PFF have been losing talent, including Dr. Eager, and also Sam Munson, Steve Palacero, founding members of the company, or people who were working there from right up at the time. And so as a result, and now the public faces a gentleman called Trevor Sycamore, who's a very entertaining podcaster. He's a very entertaining podcaster. Well done, Trevor. His opinions I struggle with. That's not to say he's disagreeable, but when you hear him describing how he does his rankings of players, that kind of thing, very often there's an emotive in there. It's not based on science. And they're meant to be a science-based company, an empirical company who form opinions based on evidence. And so, for me, this season, it's really started to pop up, particularly with the Brian Flores defence with the Vikings, which is what's pertinent to me, probably. But Flores has what can only be described as a multiple system. He will take 9 players up to the line of scrimmage as though they're going to blitz, and then 6 of those will drop off back into coverage and only 3 will go, right? So what we've got is a situation where cornerbacks are acting as linebackers are acting as safeties, and it's all total defence, if you like, very Dutch. And as a result, it's really, really difficult to actually grade people. So, for example, against the 49ers, you might have noticed Jonathan Grenard getting several tackles for loss, a sack, putting an awful lot of pressure on Brock Purdy. He graded very poorly by PFF. Apparently, the fact that he impacted the game, they only managed to convert 2 third downs the entire night, was offset by the fact that they moved the ball. And like for me, it's almost as though they're losing sense of the bigger picture, which is, what is the job of a defence? The job of a defence is to keep points off the board. The job of a defence is to impact the game in the most startling manner, in a way where it actually shifts momentum. That's what Flores is coaching these like underdog Viking players that no one's ever heard of. The defensive tackle I told you about, the free agent. Here's how a sample size doesn't prove much, but can be an indicator of something to look for in the future. When our undrafted free agent defensive tackle, what's he called, Ollie? Can you look it up for me? Tai Tuolangni or something like that. Whenever he was on the field, he was only on the field for 24 snaps against the 49ers. When he was on the field, the average yardage made by the 49ers was 0.8 yards, as opposed to when he wasn't on the field, where it was about 6.8 yards per play. Right? That's not to say he's the best defender ever, but you can look at that and you can try and route it through to other things and check, does it match the eye test? PFF did grade him very highly, but he was one of a few, and it's weird.
And we're almost circling back to what we were saying before, which is it's all about context. It's very hard to put the context in place when you're trying to be empirical about it. So, you know, the PFF grading scale is based on historically what you should have done in that position as that player. Unfortunately, the game changes as you're moving along, and as the game grows and develops, it becomes difficult to apply the same level of analysis, you know, as the game grows and develops. Look, I think Dave, you've made a perfectly succinct point, and we're just going to move it on if that's all right with everybody else around the table. If you are
Taki Taimane is the defensive tackle you're on about.
Good man, Ollie. Good man,
He
Ollie.
deserves his flowers. Like the guy, an undrafted free agent no one had ever heard of, not even a high-profile one, and he's just a stalwart.
And maybe we'll come back and talk about him in more depth in a later pod. If you're watching on YouTube, that is the end of this podcast episode. You will be able to catch the next 2 episodes on Thursday and Friday this week as we build up to the weekend. If you're listening on Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from, we will be back very, very shortly with part 2 of this week's podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, share with a friend, be absolutely brilliant, and we will be back with you after this.